Hey everyone, welcome back to Lady Empire. I have such an impressive guest here with me today. Kabrena, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here. This will be fun.
Awesome. So let's just first start off with you talking to us a little bit about your childhood and where you grew up.
Sure. I was born in Fairfield, California. My natural father was in the Air Force. Um, and then we moved shortly after that to several different states, and we ended up staying mostly in Alaska. Lived in Fairbanks for about a year, and then moved down to Anchorage. And I lived there with my parents until I went off to college. So that was about 10 years.
Wow. So did you always have a passion for science as a kid, or when do you think that sort of came about?
Um, I think in retrospect, you could characterize it that way. I would say I was always interested in observing. And I think my mom would say I was always the experimentalist.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is my parents would ask me to do something and I would need to explore why they had told me not to do this or that thing.
Right.
And like it wasn't that I didn't trust what they were saying, but I just needed to have my own understanding. And so I think that really fed the direction that I went for my professional life.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about your very impressive education. So you hold a PhD in forensic toxicology. You have three master's degrees, a bachelor's degree from the United States Air Force Academy. So talk to us a little bit about why you chose to pursue this much education. Do you think it was needed for your career and what you wanted to do, or what was sort of the decision behind all of that?
Sure. So I knew that I wanted to go for a bachelor's degree, and I knew that I was interested. By the time I was starting to think about college, I was interested in something in science or engineering. I actually thought I would go into astronautical engineering,
Mhm.
and then I had my first physics class, and I realized that was not the direction that I wanted to go. But I was interested in science, and I uh, frankly was really captivated by my first college chemistry class. So much so that halfway through the semester, when they said, well, this is an opportunity to sign up for the chemistry major. If you don't sign up and you're enjoying what you're doing, you're never going to get to do chemistry again, or words to that effect.
Yeah.
And so I suddenly got this emotional thing of, oh, I want to be playing in the lab. So I signed up for the chemistry major right then and there. But then I mean, the Air Force Academy, all the service academies are a very difficult program to get through, not just academically, but militarily, physically. It's meant to be tough, and from the academic perspective, it gives you a broad range of education. So even though you have a lot of science and engineering, you also have political science and English, and it really is a balanced education. And I thought perhaps a bachelor's was going to be enough for me. And frankly, when at the point at which I graduated, I didn't have a lot of confidence in my technical ability. And that's because I think I was judging my insides, but by what I could see on the outside from other people. And I
Right.
felt like everybody else was so accomplished and so smart. And I was somehow less than. But once I got into my um, my career as an Air Force officer, I realized that I had a real strong background of skills and knowledge that were needed for the missions that I was being asked to contribute to. And then through that, I gained the confidence and recognition that I wanted to do more studies,
Mhm.
but I still wasn't sure if I wanted to do a PhD.
Yeah.
um, and it just so happened one of the benefits of being in the military is there are education benefits. And so you could get tuition assistance to do sort of a master's degree. And there was a project management related program that was available that I could continue to work full time and also get this degree. And that was relevant to the kinds of things that I was doing that were heavily in project management, but in a technical area. And so, that was just to give me kind of a hobby to keep me occupied when I wasn't working. But it was also beneficial to my career, like I said. But I thought maybe that would be it. And then lo and behold, a few years later, I got selected to teach at the Air Force Academy, which requires a master's degree in that technical area where you're teaching. And so the Air Force actually sponsored me to get my master's in analytical chemistry. So you could say that's the master's that really like solidified me as a scientist and got me into forensic toxicology. And again, I thought, well, maybe that'll be it.
Yeah.
But I included a thesis in my master's for analytical chemistry. And I enjoyed working in the lab and realized that there were more science questions that I had than what I was able to cover in a thesis. And so a few years later, an opportunity came up to do a PhD, and I was competitively selected for that. And not only did I get to do a really interesting program of study, but I got to study internationally. I went to Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And that was just a phenomenal experience. Not only the friendships that I made, but just living in a different culture. You learn so much about your own perspectives, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of question some of the biases that you bring into everything. And so just a phenomenal experience. And then I thought the PhD was going to be done. Like no more education.
It keeps going.
But then again, the military is very interested in ensuring that their professional military is well equipped and educated. And so you have professional military education through your career. I was sent as a lieutenant colonel to National War College, which is it's one of the senior level professional military education institutions. And it's a phenomenal experience where you have fellow students from across the federal government. So not just military, but State Department, Commerce, Justice, all the intelligence agencies, and also a large number of international students. And you learn about national security strategy. And because it's so comprehensive, at the end of it, you have a master's. So
wow.
That's the history of my education.
Yeah. That is so fascinating. I can't even believe that you accomplished all of that. I have a master's degree and I wanted to pursue a PhD, and then I learned everything that goes into it. I'm like, no, I don't have that much energy and time. And so that's awesome. Let's talk a little bit about the Air Force. What sort of influenced you to join the Air Force? What sort of led you there?
Yeah, so it's interesting because when I was a kid, I respected people in the military, but I never saw it as something that I would do.
Right.
And particularly people who went to the military academies. I had seen little videos, advertisements sometimes on the news or on the television, and I sort of thought, oh, those are like godlike people. That's not me. But then when I was somewhere between my sophomore and junior year in high school, I went to a pre-college engineering and science program in San Antonio. And a lot of the classes were taught by people who had recently graduated from one or more of the military academies.
Mhm.
And because I was so the program is for kids in grades 5 through 10. And so I was in the class that was the most senior. And so we spent more time talking to the instructors than probably some of the junior students. And it was just through conversation with them and getting a better sense of what their lives were like while at the academies and also afterwards, that I realized, wow, maybe that's something that I could do. And I also realized that service to country was something that felt important to me. And I think the other thing that drew me to the academies was, at that point, again, I knew that I was interested in science or engineering of some kind. And I knew that there weren't that many women in a lot of those disciplines. And I thought, well, if I go to a military academy, I'm going to have to figure that out.
Yeah.
And I did. And it was, in some ways, more challenging than what I ever thought, just with regard to that particular dynamic. And in some ways it was easier. So
Mhm.
by which I mean, I probably benefited sometimes throughout my career, not just at the academy, because you stand out.
Right.
But that also means that if you ever fall short because you stand out, everybody notices.
Right.
So the lesson I learned was, you've got to always be on your A game.
Right, right. Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you bring up that aspect of also being a female in this academy, right? And you actually retired as a colonel from the United States Air Force, which is extremely prestigious. Did you ever feel like you had to, like you said, always be on your A game, especially because you were a female in that role? Did that play any part in, how you acted or how you held yourself to such a standard in the academy? Do you think that played any role at all in being a female there?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't realize. I mean, everybody's got a high standard coming. You don't get into a military academy without that,
Right.
and it's certainly nurtured while you're in the program. Um, I would say that by the time you graduate, you kind of are just very comfortable being that driven.
Right.
And so I didn't necessarily notice a change. What I noticed was, um, the because I was always conscious of being on my A game, that seemed unusual sometimes, in talking with some of my peers and some of the more senior people. Like, they were expecting me to do less than. When you first become a military officer, you're a lieutenant, and um, it's, you have the education, but you don't have the life experience. And so
Right.
it's not expected that you are able to walk in and handle a large amount of responsibility. But I think that, again, the rigor of the military academy programs prepares people who graduate from those programs very often to be able to handle a lot more responsibility from the start. It's not always the case, and I'm certainly not saying that other programs that offer officer commissions can't also prepare you well. It's just that I've seen some very, very excellent officers that come from the military academies, because that's my experience.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think what I noticed that people found it interesting that I was, or different, that I was so driven, but also I felt like that was necessary, and it positioned me for success. So
Right.
I think the negative aspect of that is that it's that perfectionist mindset, and then that you can turn that on yourself and
Mhm.
be hypercritical, and then that's not a healthy mindset. So working through all that is something that takes time, but and we all have our own journey, but
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you bring up a good point about responsibility. So I kind of want to jump into some of the different responsibilities that you had as well. So you managed a $30 million non-proliferation program while you were in the Air Force. So talk to us a little bit about what this means and what your role was with this project.
Yeah, so there's, when we think about national level issues, one of the things that always comes up as what we would refer to as a vital interest, meaning it's a matter that our nation takes very, very seriously. One of those is the possibility that another country may be developing or using weapons of mass destruction, or WMD. And so there are different kinds of activities that any country might undertake to not just, let's say, stop somebody from using a nuclear weapon, but perhaps discouraging their interest, making it more difficult to get the materials necessary, all the way to, obviously military action. But and so there's different kinds of programs, and those are the purview of the federal agencies that run those programs to talk about. But what my role was associated with doing and sponsoring research that would help our nation be able to do a better job at nonproliferation.
Oh, wow. Wow. So, what about, I also saw that you were a UN Special Commission Inspector and Lab Chief in Iraq. Was that also while you were in the Air Force as well? If so, tell us a little bit about what this means.
Yeah, so in 1990, Desert Storm occurred. Actually, 1990 was Desert Shield, where it was the preparation for Desert Storm, which happened in January of 1991. And then one of the things that was known prior to Desert Shield was that Iraq had chemical weapons. Saddam's regime had used them on their own people. And so after the war, the concern was about finding out where the WMD was, and then ensuring that it had been destroyed. And so while I was in the Air Force, the United Nations solicited volunteers to help with the special commission, referred to as UNSCOM, or UN Special Commission, in Baghdad, Iraq. And so I volunteered as one of the US scientists who did that. And it basically involved going to sites that Iraq had declared were associated with different programs, and talking to people who worked there, sometimes collecting samples to verify what was being said, and writing reports. And so again, I was an inspector, so I participated in those inspections. I collected samples, talked to plant workers, but I also was responsible for leading. We had a small chemical laboratory in our little headquarters building at the Canal Hotel in Baghdad. And it was just a few pieces of instrumentation, a small fume hood, and a cooler that we used for our refrigerator for our chemicals. And it was just keeping that thing running, which was an interesting experience, because not only, again, a lot of responsibility for somebody who at the time was still a lieutenant, but also crash course in international dynamics and supply chains, because since it was a UN entity, there wasn't one country that had the authority to purchase supplies and equipment. And while the equipment that was there was from the United States, it was not a straightforward process for, let's say, getting, you know, more septum cap vials or whatever it was.
Right.
And so that also meant it was a long period of time. And so you had to learn about planning things well in advance. And maybe that was one of my reasons for wanting to get a degree in project management.
Yeah. So, I mean, even just going over to Iraq and experiencing their government, the people, the food, I mean, just their way of life, right? And being exposed to that. What were your major takeaways from that whole experience? And, what, when you came home, were you just like, wow, what really stood out to you from that culture and from that entire experience?
Well, it was so interesting because since I was there as somebody who was supporting the UN and not so much as a US citizen, it's a great opportunity to not only learn about the people in the country and the culture where you are, but also all of the cultures that were represented by the teams.
Right.
And so, for example, by this time, the first time I was in Iraq was 1995. So it wasn't very long before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I had a Russian KGB officer on my inspection team, and all growing up, I never thought
Right.
that would be the case. And in terms of the Iraqis, the thing that struck me the most was, there was the government, but when we got a chance to talk to the people, they were so kind and so generous, and they harbored no ill will towards me as an American. I didn't necessarily always let on that I was American,
Right.
just in case.
Yeah.
But in the cases where I did, the response was always something like, "Oh, you are welcome here. I have a cousin who lives in Detroit," or "What? Have you ever been to Disneyland?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just, I was struck by just the generosity and also the resilience of the Iraqi people, and looking at the conditions that they had been living in, and also their ingenuity, figuring
Mhm.
out how to make a life under very extraordinarily difficult circumstances.
Mhm. And that's so interesting to hear because I feel like everyone in the US, we're so exposed to such the negativity of Iraq, right? And we all have this misconception that, it's such a negative culture, and so I love to hear a different perspective in that, you really enjoyed the people and the kindness that they offered. So I love to hear that different perspective there.
Yeah, if I could just add,
Yeah.
it's I guess the other takeaway that I have kept with me through that experience is the importance of reading more than one news source, and particularly news sources from other countries,
Right.
because every country, regardless of who they are, has their own spin on what is happening.
Mhm.
And even very reputable news sources, they have a certain perspective. And so the only way that you can start to get a better sense of it is outside of being directly involved with whatever is being reported, is exposing yourself to as many different viewpoints as possible, and then looking for that through line. What are the pieces that seem like are true regardless of who it is that's reporting? Sometimes you can't get to that. In fact, I think that's often the case.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot that I thought I knew pretty well that I realized were either just incomplete or just completely wrong in terms of my perspectives on other people.
Mhm. Absolutely. I totally agree. And I want to bring up another project as well. You provided consequence management advice for the Sydney Olympics. So talk to us a little bit about this experience. Was this while you were in Melbourne, Australia? Was this a whole different, project and things you were working on? Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so I should start off and say the Australians certainly didn't need my advice about how to handle consequence management. So just to define terms, consequence management is specifically if there's, let's say, a chemical spill or an attack on a football stadium or any kind of a major disaster. Consequence management is all those things that you do to respond, clean up, ensure anybody who might have been exposed to whatever is getting medical attention if they need it. All the things that are needed to enable you to recover to normal activities.
Right.
So yeah, Australia certainly didn't need American assistance there. But while I was in Melbourne, the group that I was working with for my degree was Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine. They had some pathologists who were already engaged in discussing with the Australian federal government things like how do you identify victims in the aftermath of a disaster. And the Sydney Olympics were in preparation. So I participated in some tabletop exercises and provided some just firsthand experience from my time in Iraq on things like hot zone procedures.
Mm-hmm.
So and facilitated discussions around, okay, how does the Australian federal system handle this? Because one of the fundamental differences in governing between Australia and the United States is that the state's powers are much stronger compared to federal, whereas in the United States, we have a strong federal system where
Right.
each state has powers, but it's sort of subordinated to federal level.
Mm-hmm.
In Australia, it was very much the case that each state kind of operated on its own. And yes, there's a federal system, but there's a lot more freedom. So it's more, how do you do that coordination and integration? And so it was a great experience. I would say it was very much a partnership, and I learned some interesting things about how things are done in Australia that made me kind of go back and reassess what I thought was the best way for the United States to do things as well.
Right. Yeah, and this is super fascinating because I'm thinking even just like about the Super Bowl, for example, and you don't really think about like the consequence management that goes into that, right? And everyone preparing for that event. And, what sort of preparation goes into these events in terms of consequence management? I mean, how long, when do they start planning for this? Who's all involved? I mean, what kind of goes into an event like this?
So, I mean, I guess the good thing to say is there's a large number of entities and individuals involved with that kind of planning, so that the average person who's going to these events doesn't have to worry about it.
Right.
And the idea is to have standard procedures that you follow, that maybe need to be tweaked here and there depending on what the event is, but that way people have an intuition. People who are needed to respond have an intuition about what they're supposed to do, and you also make sure that you're exercising that capability on a regular basis so that people are fresh and know what they need to do and know how to put on their personal protective equipment and all those little things and the coordination that needs to happen.
Yeah.
That doesn't just happen unless you're practicing it a lot. So
Right.
so yeah, and just as a side note, an example of where coordination has been challenging is when Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005.
Mhm.
Um, there was the cleanup in Florida, but then it continued to wreak havoc as it was moving across the Gulf states. And a friend of mine in the Marines who was involved in some of that cleanup said that one of the real life challenges that they had was that the radios that they had on the helicopters that they were using to fly over the areas to identify people who were stranded didn't speak to or connect to the radios that the people had at the dispatch places that they would send vehicles out to get these people. So the helicopter pilots had to fly low enough so that they could shout down
Oh,
so that they
wow.
could communicate. So that's just an example of where obviously maybe some more exercises around that kind of a disaster would have been helpful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't even think about these things, as just an average person. You don't think what all goes into, these catastrophes or these events, or, you forget about all of the preparation and all of the cleanup and everything that just goes into this. So it's super interesting.
Yeah.
So I love that you can provide these perspectives and these experiences. So I want to dive into our final topic. I've had so many great questions. I just love learning about everything you've done, but let's talk a little bit about what you're currently doing today. And please correct me if I'm wrong here, but um, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory is one of the United States Department of Energy national laboratories. And this is where you are currently working as a senior scientist. Tell us a little bit about your role and what you're working on here.
Yeah, so as you correctly state, PNNL, or Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, is one of 17 DOE national laboratories. Each of the laboratories has kind of a different set of skill sets that kind of positions us more towards different kinds of research. But it's also true that these are major research institutions. They're referred to as federally funded research and development centers, and we do renewable energy. We do some like nuclear energy research, both in terms of um, uh, helping to ensure processes are safe and using the best technology, but also looking at spent fuel that has been in storage for a long time and making sure it's still safe. Really, such a vast array of topics, but the original work that our laboratory did stemmed from the fact that Hanford, which is sort of very close to where our main campus is where the world's first plutonium was produced.
Oh, wow.
And so that wasn't our laboratory that did that, but because that capability was there, there was a recognition that there needed to be an understanding of how does radiation impact the human body.
Hmm.
And because there's people living near there, and they wanted to make sure that we could tell when somebody had been exposed, and understand what to do about it. And so that was one of the first areas of research that the laboratory was involved with.
Wow.
But these days, the breadth of research that's going on at any given time is so vast. There's no way that one person could describe it all.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I was just thinking about, is this kind of where you want to stay in research, and are you comfortable here? I mean, I can't even imagine a person like you retiring and not doing anything. What are your goals? Do you want to stay in research? Do you want to travel? And, you've done so many different things. I mean, what if what have you just absolutely loved to do and incorporating that into your goals?
Well, the great thing about working at a national laboratory is you can change what you're doing over time. And, every year you kind of get a chance to dust off and say, well, am I happy doing the kinds of things I'm doing now, or do I want to move on to something else? I've gotten to do a lot of international travel at the lab. I've gotten to manage projects. I've gotten to provide technical contributions to projects. I'm happy now,
Mm.
and so
Well,
that's
yeah.
what I'm focused on.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I'm sure you'll probably invent the next big thing or,
Oh.
something. So where can our listeners follow you on social media if you have any, or website, or where can we just see what you're working on?
So I am on professionally, I'm on LinkedIn. Uh, I'm sorry, I don't have my handles.
No, that's okay.
But I'm also on Facebook, or I guess it's called Meta now.
I
Um,
know. It's strange. It's strange.
yeah, and Instagram. Although my social presence is more on Meta. So
Okay, awesome. And I will share those links and handles and things in the notes as well. But Kabrena, thank you so much for just sharing everything, all your experiences, your perspectives, and just learning about you has been incredible. So thank you so much for sharing with us.
thank you. It was nice talking to you.